Picture this. You're standing in a grand cathedral on a cold February morning in the year 1347 AD, and you witness something that makes your blood run cold. A tiny figure draped in white silk, her small hands trembling as they hold a bouquet of winter roses, walks down the stone aisle toward her fate. She is barely 12 years old, her wedding dress tailored for a woman's body, but hanging loose on her child's frame. The man waiting at the altar is 43, his weathered hands already reaching out to claim what he considers his property. But whispers follow in their wake because everyone knows the horrifying truth. Before dawn breaks the next day, this child will be dead, beaten to death by the man who just promised to love and protect her. And what happened in that marriage chamber represents one of the most disturbing examples of sanctioned violence against children in recorded history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval brutality. It's the story of how religious authority could transform innocence into commodity, childhood into currency, and a human being into a sacrificial offering created to serve one man's twisted sense of entitlement. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval brutality. It's the story of how religious authority could transform innocence into commodity, childhood into currency, and a human being into a sacrificial offering created to serve one man's twisted sense of entitlement. The name Isabel de Montfort might not be familiar to you, but her story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of this tragedy. Lord Edmund Blackthorne wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early years showed remarkable promise. When he inherited his father's lands at just 22 years old, many believed they were witnessing the rise of a just and capable lord. He improved trade routes, funded local churches, and even established what passed for a primitive hospital in his territory. But absolute power over human lives has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls. And by 1345 AD, something had fundamentally broken inside his mind. Maybe it was the constant pressure that comes with managing vast estates in an age when one bad harvest could mean starvation for thousands. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in a territory of 8,000 souls who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, never be told they were wrong. Or maybe it was what happened to the 3 women he had already claimed as wives, each one dying under mysterious circumstances that the local priests were all too willing to overlook in exchange for generous donations to their coffers. Her name was Isabel de Montfort, and she was everything Edmund had convinced himself he deserved. Born into a minor noble family that had fallen on hard times, she represented the perfect combination of aristocratic bloodline and desperate circumstances. Her father, Sir William de Montfort, had accumulated debts that threatened to destroy not just his own future, but the survival of his entire family line. When Edmund's marriage proposal arrived, accompanied by enough gold to clear all debts and restore the family's standing, Sir William saw it as a divine intervention rather than what it actually was, a transaction in human flesh. Isabel had been living in what passed for childhood bliss in her family's modest castle. She spent her days learning to read Latin from the family chaplain, practicing needlework with her mother, and playing with the castle dogs in the courtyard. At 12, she still believed in fairy tales, still imagined that her eventual marriage would be to a handsome young knight who would sweep her off her feet and carry her away to a life of romance and adventure. She had no understanding of the biological realities that awaited her, no comprehension of the violence that men of her era considered their natural right to inflict on their wives. The betrothal ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in 1346. Isabel stood in her father's great hall, wearing her best dress, a blue wool gown that had belonged to her older sister. The contract was read aloud in Latin, words she could follow, but whose implications she couldn't fully grasp. Edmund stood beside her, his massive frame towering over her tiny form, already studying her body with the calculating gaze of a man examining livestock he intended to purchase. The wedding was scheduled for February 14th, 1347, a date chosen not for romantic reasons, but because it fell during a period when the church calendar would allow for the quickest possible consummation. Edmund had made it clear that he had no interest in a lengthy courtship or gradual introduction to married life. He wanted a wife who could immediately fulfill what he considered her primary obligations, providing him with male heirs and submitting completely to his authority in all matters. During the 4 months between betrothal and wedding, Isabel's life became a series of increasingly ominous preparations. Her mother, Lady Catherine, tried to prepare her daughter for married life, but the conversations were stilted and euphemistic. In an age when discussing the realities of sexual relations was considered improper even between mother and daughter, Isabel entered her wedding day with only the vaguest understanding of what would be expected of her. Meanwhile, Edmund's behavior during their brief meetings grew more possessive and disturbing. He would study her body with uncomfortable intensity, comment on her physical development in ways that made the adults in the room shift nervously, and make references to breaking her in properly that sent chills through anyone who heard them. The local priest, Father Benedict, had tried to counsel Edmund on the virtues of patience and gentleness with a young bride, but these conversations only seemed to inflame Edmund's sense of righteous ownership over his future wife. The wedding day itself was a masterpiece of medieval pageantry designed to mask the horror beneath. The cathedral had been decorated with tapestries and flowers. The finest musicians in the region had been hired to provide entertainment, and a feast had been prepared that would feed 300 guests. Isabel walked down the aisle in a dress of white silk, her face pale but composed, her small hands steady as they performed the required rituals. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient traditions that emphasized the transfer of property rather than the joining of hearts. Isabel repeated vows promising to love, honor, and obey her husband, words that in her context meant surrendering all legal rights to her own body and future. Edmund's vows focused on his promise to protect and provide for his wife, language that would prove brutally ironic given what was about to unfold. The wedding feast that followed was a cruel parody of celebration. Guests made toasts to the couple's future happiness while Edmund consumed increasing quantities of wine and ale. His behavior became more erratic as the evening progressed, his comments about his bride more crude and possessive. Isabel barely touched her food, sitting rigidly in her chair as the man she had just married made increasingly explicit references to what he planned to do to her once they retired to their chamber. As the evening wore on, the traditional ribald jokes and sexual innuendos that were common at medieval weddings took on a darker tone. Edmund began describing in graphic detail how he intended to teach his young wife her duties, using language that shocked even the hardened nobles who made up their wedding guests. Several of the older women tried to change the subject, but Edmund silenced them with a look that promised consequences for anyone who interfered with his enjoyment of the evening. The moment everyone had been dreading finally arrived when Edmund stood and announced it was time for the bedding ceremony. In medieval tradition, this was supposed to be a light-hearted ritual where wedding guests escorted the bride and groom to their chamber, made jokes about their wedding night, and then left them alone to consummate their marriage. But Edmund had made it clear throughout the evening that he considered this an opportunity to humiliate his bride in front of their guests. Isabel was led to the bridal chamber by a group of women who tried to offer comfort and advice, but their words rang hollow in the face of what everyone knew was about to happen. The room had been prepared according to medieval custom. with blessed sheets and religious artifacts meant to ensure fertility and protect against evil. The bed itself was massive, draped in heavy curtains that would soon conceal unspeakable violence. Edmund arrived at the chamber already half undressed, his earlier consumption of alcohol having stripped away whatever restraint he might have normally shown in front of witnesses. He dismissed the traditional wedding party with crude jokes about not wanting an audience for what he was about to do, then barred the door behind them. The heavy wooden barrier that was meant to provide privacy instead became a prison wall that trapped a 12-year-old child with a man who had already decided that her suffering was his entertainment. What happened next was witnessed only by Isabel and Edmund, but the sounds that echoed through the castle walls told a story that horrified even the hardened servants who worked in the household. The screaming began almost immediately after the door was barred, not the expected sounds of a nervous bride being initiated into married life, but the desperate shrieks of someone experiencing unimaginable pain. The violence wasn't just sexual, though that component was horrific enough. Edmund had convinced himself that his new wife needed to be broken in like a wild horse, taught through pain and humiliation that her sole purpose in life was to submit to his will. He used his fists, his feet, and various objects in the room to inflict pain that went far beyond what even medieval medicine could treat. Isabel's injuries were systematic and deliberate. Edmund focused on parts of her body that would cause maximum pain while ensuring she remained conscious to experience every moment of her torture. He broke her ribs one by one, explaining with each blow how this was teaching her to be a proper wife. He used burning candles to mark his ownership on her skin, creating scars that would serve as permanent reminders of their wedding night. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical abuse. Edmund forced Isabel to thank him for each blow, to apologize for disappointing him as a wife, and to beg for more punishment to make her worthy of his attention. When she became too weak to speak, he interpreted her silence as defiance and escalated his violence accordingly. As the night progressed, Edmund's attacks became more frenzied and less controlled. The alcohol in his system, combined with what appeared to be a complete psychological break from reality, transformed him into something barely human. He began to see Isabel not as a person, but as an object that existed solely to absorb his rage and frustration. The servants in the castle tried to intervene several times throughout the night, but the heavy door to the bridal chamber had been barred from the inside, and Edmund had threatened to kill anyone who attempted to interfere with his marriage rights. The local priest was summoned, but even he was powerless to act against a lord exercising what medieval law considered his legal authority over his wife. By dawn, the screaming had stopped. When Edmund finally emerged from the chamber, his clothes were soaked in blood, and his expression showed no remorse for what he had done. He announced to the waiting household that his wife had proven herself unworthy of his name, and that God had judged her accordingly by taking her life. Isabel de Montfort died as the sun rose on February 15th, 1347, exactly 18 hours after she had spoken vows promising to love and honor the man who murdered her. Her body showed evidence of trauma so extensive that even the medieval medical authorities who examined her remains were shocked by the deliberate nature of her injuries. The official cause of death was listed as complications from the consummation of marriage, a euphemism that allowed church and secular authorities to avoid investigating what had clearly been a deliberate murder. Edmund's status as a local lord, combined with medieval laws that gave husbands absolute authority over their wives, meant that no charges were ever filed and no justice was ever pursued. But the story of Isabel's murder spread despite official attempts to suppress it. Servants who had heard her screams told their friends and families, creating a network of whispered testimony that preserved the truth of what had happened. Local women began to avoid Edmund, recognizing him as a man who was capable of unspeakable violence against the most vulnerable members of society. Edmund's attempts to find a new wife met with consistent failure. Noble families who had initially seen him as a desirable match for their daughters suddenly found reasons to decline his proposals. The few families desperate enough to consider his offers demanded such extreme financial compensation that even Edmund's considerable wealth couldn't meet their terms. The psychological impact of Isabel's murder extended far beyond the immediate participants. Young women throughout the region lived in terror of similar fates, understanding that marriage could legally transform them from protected daughters into property that could be abused or destroyed at will. Parents struggled with the knowledge that their daughter's safety depended entirely on the character of men they might have no real opportunity to evaluate. The church's response to Isabel's death revealed the institution's complicity in systems that treated women and children as disposable commodities. Rather than investigating the circumstances of her death or questioning the laws that had made her murder legally permissible, church authorities focused on suppressing discussion of the incident to protect what they considered more important social stability. Medieval medical texts from this period show that Isabel's case was far from unique. Physicians regularly treated young wives for injuries that would be immediately recognized today as evidence of systematic abuse. But contemporary medical understanding attributed these injuries to women's supposed physical and moral weaknesses, rather than to deliberate violence by their husbands. The legal framework that had made Isabel's murder possible continued to operate for centuries after her death, claiming countless other victims whose stories have been lost to history. The concept of marriage as a transfer of property rights rather than a partnership between equals meant that women like Isabel existed in a legal gray area where they could be tortured and killed without consequences for their attackers. Edmund Blackthorne lived for another 37 years after murdering his 12-year-old bride, dying in 1384 as a respected member of his community who was remembered in church records as a devoted husband who suffered the tragedy of losing his young wife. His obituary made no mention of the circumstances of Isabel's death, and his tombstone praised him as a just lord and faithful Christian. The erasure of Isabel's story from official records was systematic and deliberate. Her name was removed from church registries. Her grave marker identified her only as beloved wife of Lord Edmund, and all legal documents related to her death were either destroyed or hidden in church archives that remained sealed for centuries. But stories like Isabel's have a way of surviving, despite official attempts to suppress them. Oral traditions preserved by the women of the region kept her memory alive, passing down cautionary tales that helped protect future generations from similar fates. These whispered histories became part of a broader resistance movement that challenged the legal and religious systems that treated women and children as property. The parallels between Isabel's story and contemporary issues of domestic violence are impossible to ignore. The same systems of power and authority that made her murder legally permissible continue to operate today in different forms, protecting perpetrators and silencing victims through legal, economic, and social mechanisms. Modern domestic violence statistics show that women are most likely to be killed by intimate partners, echoing the medieval reality that marriage could legally transform protection into predation. The language used to describe these crimes has evolved, but the underlying dynamics of power, control, and sanctioned violence remain disturbingly similar. Child marriage continues to affect millions of young girls worldwide, with many facing violence and abuse similar to what Isabel experienced over 6 centuries ago. The legal frameworks that protect these practices often mirror the medieval systems that made Isabel's murder possible, prioritizing traditional authority structures over individual human rights. The institutional responses to contemporary domestic violence also echo the medieval church's handling of Isabel's case, with authorities often more concerned with maintaining social stability than with protecting vulnerable individuals. Victim blaming, evidence suppression, and systematic bias in favor of perpetrators continue to characterize official responses to intimate partner violence. Perhaps most disturbingly, the economic factors that forced Isabel's parents to sell their daughter to Edmund Blackthorne continue to operate today in communities where poverty makes children vulnerable to exploitation through forced marriage, human trafficking, and other forms of systematic abuse. The story of Isabel de Montfort serves as a bridge between historical and contemporary understanding of gender-based violence, illustrating how systems of oppression adapt and evolve while maintaining their fundamental character across centuries and cultures. Her death on that February morning in 1347 was not just a medieval tragedy, but a symptom of broader human patterns that continue to claim victims today. The 12-year-old girl who walked down that cathedral aisle in her white silk dress represents every child who has ever been sacrificed to adult systems of power, control, and exploitation. In remembering Isabel, we honor not just her individual suffering, but the experiences of countless women and children whose stories have been erased from official histories, but whose pain echoes through time in the voices of survivors who refuse to be silenced. Tonight, somewhere in the world, another child faces the same terror that Isabel experienced in that medieval bridal chamber. The technologies have evolved, the legal language has been updated, but the fundamental dynamic of powerful adults exploiting vulnerable children remains tragically constant across centuries and cultures. The candles that Edmund used to torture his 12-year-old bride have been replaced by other instruments of control and abuse, but the essential cruelty remains unchanged. The church authorities who covered up Isabel's murder have their modern equivalents in institutions that prioritize reputation over justice, protecting perpetrators at the expense of victims. Yet there is hope in the very fact that we can tell Isabel's story today, that her name can be spoken aloud and her suffering acknowledged after centuries of official silence. The women who preserved her memory through whispered oral traditions understood something that medieval authorities did not, that bearing witness to injustice is the first step toward preventing its repetition. The legal reforms that have made spousal murder illegal in most of the world represent genuine progress built on the accumulated testimony of victims like Isabel, whose suffering finally became too widespread to ignore. The activists who fight against child marriage today carry forward the resistance that began with medieval women who refused to let stories like Isabel's disappear entirely. In honoring the memory of this 12-year-old girl whose life ended in unimaginable violence, we commit ourselves to building a world where no child will ever again be sacrificed to adult systems of power and control. Her story reminds us that behind every statistic about gender-based violence lies an individual human being whose pain and dignity deserve recognition and respect. Isabel de Montfort died as the sun rose over a medieval castle on February 15, 1347, but her story lives on as a testament to the human capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and fierce resistance. In remembering her, we ensure that her death was not meaningless, that her suffering contributes to a broader understanding of injustice that might ultimately help protect other children from similar fates. The white silk dress that became her burial shroud, the cathedral where she spoke her wedding vows, and the castle chamber where she died all stand as monuments to the reality that civilization's greatest achievements can coexist with its most devastating failures. But they also remind us that progress is possible, that the legal and social systems that made Isabel's murder possible have been challenged and changed by generations of activists who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. As you turn off this video and return to your own life, carry with you the memory of a 12-year-old girl who deserved protection but received violence, who trusted in fairy tale promises but encountered unspeakable reality, whose death serves as a bridge between historical understanding and contemporary action. What happened to Isabel de Montfort was not just a medieval tragedy, but a human story that connects across centuries to every effort to protect children, challenge systems of exploitation, and build a world where power serves justice rather than satisfying the cruel appetites of those who wield it.